What if one of the biggest threats to faith in Jesus is not persecution? No, but confusion inside the church itself. What if a community that claims to carry the message of Jesus, slowly loses sight of what it actually exists to do? And there is a letter in the New Testament that speaks directly into that crisis. This is the First Epistle to Timothy. It is not written to a congregation, no, but to a young leader trying to guide a fragile church through false teaching and power struggles and cultural pressure. And what's remarkable is this: the letter is not mainly about church bureaucracy or administration. No, it's about protecting the purpose of the church. Because when a community forgets why it exists, everything else begins to collapse, right? So what's the world behind First Timothy? Well, the letter we called First Epistle to Timothy was written between 62 and 66 AD, likely after Paul's release from his first Roman imprisonment, probably in Macedonia. And it is presented as written by the Apostle Paul to his close co-worker Timothy, who had been left in the influential city of Ephesus. Ephesus was a major urban center in the Roman world, economically powerful, religiously diverse, and home to the famous Temple of Artemis, one of the largest temples of the ancient world. The church there was not isolated from its environment, you see. Ideas were circulating, competing teachers were emerging, and some were turning the faith in Jesus into speculative debates about myths and genealogies and spiritual status. And you could say that instead of transforming lives, these teachings were producing arguments. So the letter focuses on something crucial. What should the church actually look like when it lives out the gospel? And the answer might surprise you. That is why here are 3 insights that might change how you read this letter. First insight: the goal of biblical teaching is not information. No. One of the most striking lines in 1 Timothy appears right at the beginning. Paul tells Timothy that the goal of instruction is love. A love that comes from a pure heart, a good conscience, and sincere faith. And that statement completely reframes what teaching in the church is supposed to accomplish, right? Because in the ancient world, many teachers, they built reputations by displaying intellectual sophistication. But here, theological brilliance is not the measure of success. Transformation is. The purpose of teaching of the Bible is not endless debate, intellectual status, or clever interpretations. No, it is the formation of a certain kind of people whose lives visibly reflect love. And according to the letter, whenever teaching produces pride, division, or endless controversy, something has gone deeply wrong. And that's why here's the second insight. Leadership in the church is about character, not charisma. One of the most quoted sections in 1 Timothy describes qualifications for church leaders. I think you know about that. But what's fascinating is what the list emphasizes. It does not highlight eloquence. It does not demand advanced education. It never mentions strategic brilliance, for example. Instead, it focuses almost entirely on character, faithfulness in relationships, self-control, hospitality, integrity in daily life. In other words, leadership credibility in the church is rooted not in talent, but in a life that is already being shaped by the gospel. You see, in a culture that often celebrates visibility and influence, this letter quietly insists on something different. The people who guide the church must already be living the life the church is meant to embody. Because the message of Jesus cannot be separated from the character of those who represented it, right? And third insight, the church exists to display something to the world. Near the center of the letter, Paul describes the church in a very powerful way, in my opinion. He says to Timothy, "Although I hope to come to see you soon, I am writing you these instructions so that if I am delayed, you will know how people ought to conduct themselves in God's household, which is the church of the living God, the pillar and foundation of the truth." That's an architectural metaphor, right? Because a pillar doesn't create truth. You notice that? A pillar holds something up so everyone can see it. According to Paul, then, the church's role in the world is not simply to defend doctrine internally. It is to display the reality of the gospel publicly. Through its life together, through its integrity, through its care for the vulnerable. The church becomes a visible structure that lifts the truth about God high enough for the world to notice, which means the credibility of the message is deeply tied to the life of the community carrying it. So why 1 Timothy 2 matters today? Well, the challenges described in this letter sound surprisingly familiar today. Confusing teachings, influential personalities, arguments that generate more heat than light, and communities trying to figure out what faithful leadership actually looks like. So the short letter reminds us that the health of the church does not begin with strategies, no, or programs, no, or public influence, no. It begins with something quieter and harder, actually. Lives that reflect the truth the church proclaims. Because the church cannot convincingly announce good news if its life together tells a different story, right? And here's the closing line. In the end, 1 Timothy is not merely about organizing church life. It's not about administration. It's about protecting the church's identity. The church exists to hold the truth of the gospel up for the world to see. And that means every generation faces the same question. Will the church become just another place for religious talk, or will it become a community whose life makes the reality of God impossible to ignore? Because when a community truly lives the gospel, well, the world doesn't just hear the message. No, it sees it.